Right now, somewhere in a car on a highway, someone is listening to music on FM radio. The sound is clean, no static, no interference. Just signal, pure and direct, traveling through the air at the speed of light into the ears of roughly 4 billion people every single day. Ask anyone who invented it. They'll say Marconi maybe, or they'll shrug and say RCA. They're wrong. His name was Edwin Howard Armstrong. He built FM radio from the ground up, the mathematics, the theory, the hardware, the proof. He transmitted the first FM broadcast himself from a tower in Alpine, New Jersey, on a night in 1935. And then a corporation he helped build, led by a man he considered his closest friend, spent the next 19 years methodically destroying him. By January 1954, Armstrong was 63 years old, broke, his patents tied up in courts he could no longer afford, his marriage broken under the strain of a legal war he had been fighting almost alone. He put on his overcoat. He put on his dress gloves. He stepped out of the 13th floor window of his apartment on Riverside Drive and fell to the street below. The next day, RCA offered his widow a settlement. Edwin Howard Armstrong was born in New York City in 1890, the son of a publishing executive, and from the time he was a child, he was drawn to wireless transmission with an intensity that went beyond hobby. He built a 40-foot antenna in his backyard in Yonkers when he was 14, not to impress anyone, to understand. He needed to know how radio waves worked, how they propagated, why they faded, what could be done about interference, with the urgency of someone solving a problem that wouldn't let him sleep. He enrolled at Columbia University in 1909 and studied under Professor Michael Pupin, one of the few electrical engineers in America at the time who genuinely grasped the emerging science of radio. But Armstrong's real laboratory was the attic of his parents' house in Yonkers, and later, the Columbia campus itself. He was relentlessly empirical. He didn't theorize from a distance. He built circuits, measured results, revised, rebuilt. By 1912, when Armstrong was 22 years old, he had invented the regenerative circuit, a method of feeding amplified radio signals back into themselves to dramatically increase receiver sensitivity. It was, at the time, the most significant advance in radio since Marconi's original transmissions. With a regenerative receiver, signals that had been too weak to detect could now be heard clearly across thousands of miles. Armstrong demonstrated this to his professor. He then rode his motorcycle. He was an obsessive motorcyclist, down to the Columbia campus to make the official measurements. The date was recorded. The notebooks exist. He filed a patent in 1913. He would spend the next decade defending it in court against Lee DeForest, who filed a competing patent for a similar circuit and whose lawyers were better funded and more persistent. The courts eventually ruled for DeForest on the narrowest possible grounds, that DeForest had filed certain paperwork first, though evidence strongly suggests DeForest did not fully understand what his own circuit was doing. Armstrong believed, with documented justification, that the decision was wrong. Most engineers at the time agreed with him. The Institute of Radio Engineers awarded Armstrong their Medal of Honor in 1917. The courts had given DeForest the patent. The engineers had given Armstrong the credit. This would become a pattern. It was during these years that Armstrong met David Sarnoff. Sarnoff was a young immigrant from Uzlian, Belarus, who had come to America as a child and clawed his way into the Marconi Wireless Telegraph Company through sheer tenacity. He was not an engineer. He was something rarer and, in his way, equally gifted, a man who could look at a piece of technology and see, immediately, what it would become. When he encountered Armstrong's regenerative circuit, he understood its value. More importantly, he understood Armstrong. The two men became genuine friends. This is not a contested point. They corresponded warmly for years. Sarnoff championed Armstrong's work inside the company that would eventually become RCA, the Radio Corporation of America, where Sarnoff rose to become president and then chairman. Armstrong trusted Sarnoff completely. When Armstrong invented the superheterodyne circuit in 1918, another foundational advance, the architecture that still underlies virtually every radio receiver on Earth, he licensed it to RCA. When he invented the super-regenerative circuit, he sold that patent to RCA too. Armstrong was not naive. He was simply genuinely loyal. And the loyalty, for years, was real and mutual. Then came FM. The problem Armstrong was trying to solve in the late 1920s was static. Static was the great unsolved problem of radio. It plagued AM, amplitude modulation, the broadcast standard of the era. Lightning storms, electrical equipment, the ionosphere itself could drown out a signal entirely. The industry had largely concluded that static was an irreducible fact of radio physics. You could minimize it, you could not eliminate it. Armstrong disagreed. He had been working on the problem quietly, in a Columbia laboratory that RCA helped fund, for several years when the insight crystallized. The conventional wisdom held that static was inseparable from radio transmission, because static and signal both arrived at a receiver with variations in amplitude, in wave height. The solution the industry kept proposing was to narrow the broadcast bandwidth. Less width, less noise. Armstrong thought this was wrong. He thought it was precisely backwards. What if, instead of modulating the amplitude of the wave, you modulated its frequency, its rate of oscillation? What if the information was encoded not in how tall the wave was, but in how fast it was cycling? Static, by its nature, attacks amplitude. A frequency-modulated signal would be, in principle, immune to it. The mathematics said it shouldn't work at the bandwidths anyone had tried. Armstrong extended the bandwidth dramatically, far wider than any engineer had thought practical, and discovered that the relationship between signal quality and bandwidth was not linear. It was transformational. Wideband FM didn't just reduce static, it essentially eliminated it. He built a prototype transmitter on the roof of the Empire State Building, where RCA had given him space to work, and demonstrated the system to Sarnoff in 1934. There is an account, reported by people present, that when Sarnoff heard music transmitted over FM for the first time, clear, full, free of any interference, his response was quiet. He understood what he was hearing. He said something to the effect that Armstrong hadn't invented a better radio. He had invented a new radio. And that was the problem. RCA had spent the 1920s and 1930s building an AM broadcasting empire. Its stations, its infrastructure, its licensing revenue, all of it was AM. The company was also, at that moment, pivoting aggressively toward television, and its spectrum strategy depended on keeping FM marginal. A successful FM rollout would require new transmitters, new receivers, new frequency allocations from the FCC. It would cannibalize everything RCA had already built. Sarnoff did not ban FM, he did something more effective, he slowed it. Armstrong was given his tower space at the Empire State Building, and then, when he demonstrated FM convincingly, RCA asked him to remove the transmitter. The company declined to develop the technology further. Armstrong, refusing to wait, raised his own capital and built a 400-foot transmitter tower in Alpine, New Jersey, in 1937 and 1938. In 1939, he began regular FM broadcasts, the first in history. Engineers and listeners who heard them described the experience as transformative. The sound was demonstrably superior to anything AM could produce. A small number of broadcasters began building FM stations. The technology was beginning to find its market. Then came a decision that Armstrong, for the rest of his life, attributed directly to RCA's lobbying. In 1945, the FCC moved the FM broadcast band from its original 40-50 MHz allocation to 88-108 MHz, where it remains today. The move was technically justified by some engineers, who cited concerns about ionospheric interference at the lower frequencies. Armstrong and his allies contended the concerns were overstated, and the real motive was to strand the 1 million FM receivers already in American homes, making them useless overnight and forcing the market to restart from zero. Whether the 1945 decision was primarily technical or primarily political remains a matter of genuine historical debate. What is not in dispute is that it set back FM adoption by years and provided a massive structural advantage to broadcasters who had lobbied for exactly this outcome. Armstrong sued RCA in 1948. This was not a surprise. What was a surprise, to Armstrong at least, was the scale of what followed. RCA's legal strategy was not simply to contest the patents, it was to exhaust him. The corporation filed countersuits, subpoenaed thousands of documents, demanded depositions that stretched across months. The litigation was structured to be expensive and slow. Armstrong was not a poor man, but he was a single individual against one of the largest corporations in America. He borrowed against his securities. He mortgaged his assets. He paid his legal fees himself, month after month, year after year, while RCA's lawyers billed their hours to a company with effectively unlimited resources. By 1953, Armstrong had been fighting for 5 years. Several defendants in related suits had quietly settled with him, which was itself a form of acknowledgement. They had paid, which meant they knew the patents were valid. But RCA would not settle, and Armstrong, by then, had depleted nearly everything he had. In October 1953, in a moment of desperation and grief that their marriage never recovered from, he struck his wife Marion with a fireplace poker during an argument about the costs of the litigation. Marion left. She moved out. Armstrong was alone in the apartment on Riverside Drive, and by every account of people who knew him, he was not well. He wrote letters in those final months to old friends, to colleagues, to Marion herself, that described a man whose sense of purpose and self had been dismantled piece by piece. He had spent 40 years inventing things that changed the world. He had been cheated by courts, outmaneuvered by corporations, and abandoned by the man whose career he had done more than almost anyone to advance. In the early hours of January 31, 1954, he dressed carefully. Overcoat, dress gloves, scarf. He opened the window and stepped through it. The technical and legal record of what Armstrong invented, and when he invented it, is not ambiguous. His FM patent applications are dated 1933. His laboratory notebooks, his correspondence with the FCC, the testimony of engineers who witnessed his demonstrations. The chronology is documented in granular detail. Several of the companies that RCA had lined up as co-defendants in Armstrong's suits settled before trial, paying him royalties that were, in effect, admissions of infringement. One of those settlements was with Motorola, which manufactured FM receivers. The principle at stake, that Armstrong was first, that the patents were valid, that manufacturers had been using his technology without compensation, was established by the outcomes of these cases even before his death. The day after he died, RCA settled with his estate. The settlement figure has been reported at approximately $1 million. His widow Marion Armstrong subsequently pursued the remaining litigation herself with formidable tenacity, and across the following years, won or settled virtually every outstanding case. The record, in the end, vindicated Armstrong on almost every point that mattered. But the vindication came to a widow, not to the man who had built the transmitters and filed the patents and sat in deposition after deposition, watching his life's work be contested by lawyers paid to question whether he had done what every engineer in America knew he had done. There have been corrections, partial and quiet. In 1980, Armstrong was inducted into the National Inventors Hall of Fame. Columbia University, where he spent most of his working life, has a building named for him. There is a plaque at the site of his Alpine Tower. The IEEE, the Institute of Electrical and Electronics Engineers, regards him as one of the most consequential figures in the history of electrical engineering, alongside Tesla and Edison. These are not trivial honors. They are also honors given long after the man who deserved them was gone. David Sarnoff died in 1971. In his later years, he spoke of Armstrong occasionally in ways that suggested, to some observers, something that might have been regret, or might simply have been the measured distance of a man who had made a decision and lived with it. He never publicly acknowledged that RCA's litigation strategy had been designed to destroy Armstrong rather than contest him. He was a brilliant man, Sarnoff. He understood power and industry in ways that Armstrong, for all his genius, never did and perhaps never wanted to. What he did to Armstrong was not an accident of circumstance or an oversight of history. It was a choice, made deliberately, sustained over nearly 2 decades, with full knowledge of the human cost. FM radio is in roughly 4 billion devices on Earth. It transmits every emergency broadcast, every classical station, every late-night drive home. The standard that Armstrong built, wideband frequency modulation, is the technical foundation of signals that will outlast every living person who has never heard his name. The physics he worked out in a Columbia laboratory in the late 1920s and early 1930s will be transmitting signal for as long as there is air to carry it. His apartment building at 435 Riverside Drive still stands. The 13th floor is still there. The window faces the Hudson. Edwin Howard Armstrong put on his gloves and stepped through it. The next day, the company that owed him everything settled his estate for what amounted to a fraction of the revenue his invention had generated. The history books filled in the blank spaces with other names or left them blank entirely. He gave the world a sound it hears every day. It does not know his name. That seems worth sitting with for a while.